My grandfather's phone held messages I never sent, and messages he never wrote. My grandfather was dying, and my father met me at the hospital with his arms folded. He said the words, "I will never forget. He doesn't want to see you." I almost turned around. I almost believed him. But a nurse caught my sleeve 15 minutes later, pulled me through a side door, put my grandfather's phone in my hand. What I read on that screen made my knees give out in a stairwell. There were messages from me to him, cruel ones, saying I'd never come back, saying I had my own life now, leave me alone. Except I never sent them. There were messages from him to me, cold ones, telling me to stop calling, that he was fine, that I should live my life. Except he never wrote them. And buried in the middle in the drafts folder, one real message, written in his shaking hand, sent nowhere. "Penelope, please. I don't know what's happening to my money. He took my keys. I am scared." I read it 3 times on a stairwell floor while a nurse watched me fall apart. One person had sat in my grandfather's house on his phone and mine and written both halves of a betrayal. So we'd each believe the other had walked away. I knew who. I'd known since the hallway. The only question left was what I was going to do about it. And I do this for a living. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if you found out someone had been pretending to be you to hurt the person you loved most? Let me back up. For months earlier, my grandfather Arthur stopped answering my calls. I texted. Nothing came back. I mailed him a birthday card and it returned to my mailbox stamped "Return to Sender," which made no sense because he'd lived in that house for 45 years. I knew enough law to know what that wall meant. I knew enough about my father to be afraid of it. But I told myself he was busy, or stubborn, or tired of phones. I buried the worry and worked the way I bury everything. That's my flaw if you want to name it. I take on too much. Ego quiet. And I tell myself silence is the same as keeping the peace. It isn't. While I was keeping the peace, my father was rewriting my grandfather's life. One signature at a time. I just didn't know whose hand was holding the pen. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. A number I didn't know lit up my phone. I almost let it ring out. People who work in elder law learn to screen calls. But something told me to answer. A woman's voice came through low and fast. "Is this Penelope?" Arthur Vance's granddaughter. She said her name was Dolores, charge nurse on the cardiac floor. My grandfather had been asking for me for 5 days. I told her that didn't make sense. I'd been trying to reach him for months. She went quiet for a second. Then she said the thing that put a cold weight in my chest. "Honey, your father blocked every call. He told us you didn't want to be involved." I stood up so fast my chair rolled into the filing cabinet. I asked her if Arthur was lucid. She said yes, completely. That he knew exactly who he was waiting for. I asked why she was risking her job to call me. She said, "Because I've watched that man ask for you every single morning and I can't watch it anymore." I had my keys in my hand before she finished the sentence. "The drive to Millbrook takes 4 hours if you don't stop." I didn't. The whole way I rehearsed being kind. I told myself my father was scared. That fear makes people territorial. That I would walk in soft and we would handle this like adults. I am good at rehearsing. I'm less good at what comes after. It was dark when I reached the edge of town. I checked into the Pine Cone Motel off Route 12 because I had nowhere else to sleep. My father and his wife Cynthia had moved into Arthur's house months ago to help. And I knew better than to think there was a bed in it for me. I dropped my bag, washed my face, drove the last mile to the hospital with my hands tight on the wheel. The parking lot was half empty under the sodium lights. That's where I saw the first thing that didn't fit. Arthur's truck. The old blue one he'd driven since I was a girl. Parked in the visitor row. I knew that truck like I knew his voice. But the plate was new. The registration sticker was current. And it wasn't in his name anymore. I stood in the cold and stared at it longer than I should have. A truck doesn't change hands while a man lies dying. Unless someone's in a hurry. I didn't have the word for it yet. The word was theft. The front desk of Lakeside Regional is a half circle of laminate with a tired woman behind it and a sign that says, "All visitors must be on the approved list." I gave her my name. She typed it. Frowned. Typed it again. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not finding you." I told her Arthur Vance was my grandfather. That he'd raised me. That I'd driven from Cleveland. She gave me the look people give you when they want to help and can't. The patient's family has set the visitor list, she said. And there's a power of attorney on file naming his son as the contact. I asked who set the list. She wouldn't say. She didn't have to. I knew the shape of it. My father had built a paper wall and put my name on the wrong side of it. I leaned on the counter and kept my voice level because raising it never opens a door. I asked if I could speak to a nurse, a social worker, anyone. She said she'd pass a message. I could see in her face that the message would die in a drawer. I thanked her because she wasn't the one who'd done this. And I stepped back into the lobby and tried to think like the paralegal I am instead of the granddaughter. I didn't make it far. I'd circled toward the elevators, hoping to look like I belonged, when my father came around the corner like he'd been waiting for me. Gordon Vance is 62 now. Heavier than he used to be. With our same gray eyes and none of Arthur's warmth. Cynthia was a step behind him, phone in hand, watching. He didn't say hello. He planted himself in the middle of the hallway and crossed his arms the way he had when I was a kid, and he wanted to look bigger than he felt. You shouldn't have come, he said. I told him I came because Arthur was dying and I wanted to see him. He shook his head slowly, almost sad, performing it. He doesn't want to see you. There it was again, the line that would follow me through everything that came after. He said it gently, which was worse than if he'd shouted because gentleness made it sound true. Cynthia nodded along like a backup singer. He needs his rest, Penelope. You'll only upset him. I looked at my father and I asked him one question. Then why did a nurse call me? His face did something then. A flicker fast as a second hand. Fear not grief. He covered it quickly and told me to go home. That they had it handled. That I checked out years ago and didn't get a vote now. I didn't argue. Arguing is what he wanted. I said, okay. And I turned and I walked toward the front door so he'd watch me leave. He did. He always watches the door he thinks he's closed. The east entrance was around the back. Past the loading dock and a row of dumpsters where the light was bad and the door was propped with a folded paper towel. A woman in scrubs stood just inside it. I knew her voice before she spoke. Dolores. She was older than I'd pictured. Silver hair pinned back. The kind of steady you only get from 35 years of holding other people's worst nights. She caught my sleeve and pulled me in out of the cold. I saw your father go to the elevators. He thinks you left. She walked me fast down a service corridor, talking low the whole way. Your grandpa's been asking for you since Saturday. Every morning I'd tell him you were coming and he'd watch that door. She stopped at a supply alcove and reached into her pocket. He made me promise something. He said if his son turned you away, I was to give you this. She put a phone in my hand. Not a hospital phone. Arthur's phone. The cheap smartphone I'd set up for him myself 4 years ago. The case still the dull red I'd chosen. It was warm from her pocket. He couldn't reach the charger from the bed, she said. So I've been keeping it alive for him. He wants you to read it. I asked her what was on it. Her mouth tightened. I think you should see for yourself. And I think you should sit down first. I didn't sit. I should have. I pressed the button and the screen woke and the first thing it showed me was a text conversation with my own name at the top. The thread was labeled Penelope. That little red heart is the detail that still wakes me up at night. Because the most recent messages in it were from me. Except I never sent them. There they sat. Blue bubbles in my name. Cold as stones. Stop calling here. I have my own life now. I'm not coming. Don't ask again. I scrolled and my hands went numb. The thread went back months. It was full of cruelty I would never have written to the man who raised me. Whoever did it had studied me. They used the way I sign off. They used a joke only Arthur and I shared. Turned inside out to wound him. I leaned back against the cinder block wall and slid down it until I was sitting on the cold floor of that stairwell. The phone shaking in my hand. Dolores crouched beside me and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. I thought I understood it then. I thought someone had pretended to be me. I was half right. I scrolled up further, past the lies in my name, and found a second pattern underneath. And that was when the floor really dropped. There were messages going the other way too. Messages to me from Arthur's phone that I'd never received. Don't come back. I'm fine. Stop fussing. You have your life. Live it. Each one written in a flat, clipped voice that wasn't his. Arthur rambled. Arthur told stories sideways. Arthur never in his life used the word fussing. And buried in the middle of all of it, on a Sunday in March, was one real message. It had been typed slowly. I could tell because the autocorrect was half fixed and half not. The way his shaking hands always left it. It said only, "Penelope, please. I don't know what's happening to my money." He took my keys. I am scared. It had been deleted from the sent folder. But it sat in the drafts. Never delivered. By March my number was already blocked. He'd written to me for help. And the message had nowhere to go. I read it 3 times. I was not crying, which surprised me. I had gone somewhere past crying. Somewhere cold and clear. The place I go when a case stops being sad and starts being solvable. Because every fake message in my name and every fake message in his came from the same hand. One person had sat in my grandfather's house on my grandfather's phone, and his own, and written both halves of a betrayal. So we'd each believe the other had walked away. I knew who. I'd known since the hallway. The only question left was what I was going to do about it. And I do this for a living. Dolores got me to his room while my father was down in the cafeteria. She did it the way nurses do everything that matters, quietly and without making a show of it. And she wasn't going rogue, whatever it looked like. Arthur was alert and clear-headed. A lucid patient gets to decide for himself who sits at his bedside, no matter whose name is on the paperwork. The room was dim. One lamp. The monitor ticking its slow green line. And there he was. Arthur looked smaller than the last time. The way the old do when the body starts giving back what it borrowed. But when the door opened, his eyes found me and lit up like a porch light. And he said my name. Just my name. Penelope. And the years fell off it. I took his hand. It trembled in mine. The tremor he'd had for a decade. The one that ended his repair work but never touched his mind. He pulled me close and his voice was a thread. They told me you stopped coming. They showed me. I told him I never sent those. He nodded slow like he'd already known and hadn't dared believe it. I didn't write the ones to you either, he whispered. Whatever they said in my name, it wasn't me. That closed the last gap. Then the door opened and Cynthia was there. All bright concern. Snapping the overhead light on. Penelope, he needs his rest. She crossed to the bed and started fussing with his blanket. Repeating my father's line back at me like a script. You'll only upset him. Arthur's hand tightened on mine before she could pry us apart. And he got out the words I carried into every room after that. Don't let him win. I told him I wouldn't. And I meant it the way you mean a thing you've decided to spend everything on. Cynthia walked me out. But she couldn't walk the paralegal out of me. On the way down the hall, I read the whiteboard at the nurse's station. The one with the care team notes. I clocked the words. Poson Gordon Vance. Back in the lobby, I did what I do for any client. I started asking the right questions of the right people. A floor clerk, kept honest by my knowing the vocabulary, confirmed what I'd guessed. There was a financial power of attorney on file. Signed about 7 years ago. Naming my father as agent. 7 years. That tracked. My grandmother Ruth had died 7 years ago. And in the fog after, Arthur had signed something my father put in front of him to help with the bills. A convenience document. The kind millions of decent people sign and never think about again. And Cynthia had been telling the staff that Arthur was confused. Not himself. Softening the ground for the story that he couldn't make his own choices anymore. I stood in that lobby and felt the whole shape of it click into place like a gear seating in a movement. My father wasn't forging anything. He didn't have to. He had a real document signed by a real hand. And he was using it like a crowbar. The question that mattered, the only one, was whether a 7-year-old convenience POA could hold a man prisoner who still knew his own name. I already suspected the answer. I needed someone to confirm it before I bet my grandfather's last days on it. I called Mr. Foster from the motel parking lot at 10 that night. He's the attorney I've worked for since I got my certificate. Elder law. 32 years at it. The kind of man who answers his cell after hours because he knows the calls that come after hours are the ones that count. I laid it out in order the way he taught me. The blocked calls. The impersonation. The truck with the new plate. The convenience POA from 7 years back. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked the one question I was hoping he'd ask. Is your grandfather still competent? I said yes. Clear as a bell. The nurses would back it. Then your father's standing on sand, he said. And he walked me through it slow so I'd hold it. A power of attorney is a gift from the principal. As long as the principal has capacity, he can take that gift back anytime he wants. In writing. Notice to the agent, the bank, the hospital. Capacity isn't about steady hands or a strong heart, Foster said. It's about whether he understands the decision and its consequences. A shaking hand has never made a man incompetent. I asked what I'd need. He counted it off. A documented capacity assessment by a physician. A clean written revocation. A new power of attorney and a healthcare directive properly signed and notarized. Get those, he said. And your father's authority evaporates the second your grandfather signs. For the first time in 4 days I had a map. I just needed the one thing my father had sworn I'd never get again. 20 minutes alone with Arthur and a notary who'd come to a hospital bed. My brother Kevin found me at the motel the next morning before I'd finished my coffee. He's 5 years older than me and has spent his whole life one bad decision behind. He stood in my doorway looking like he hadn't slept and he didn't come in. You need to let Dad handle this, Penelope. I asked him, handle what? He wouldn't meet my eyes. Grandpa's affairs. Dad's got it under control. You coming in here just makes it worse. I asked him, worse for who? And that's when it slipped out. The way the truth slips out of people who were never built to carry it. Look, Dad said once it settled, he'd take care of my situation. Okay. The cards, the truck loan. He said there's enough. There it was. My grandfather's savings weren't just vanishing. They were going somewhere with an address. Dad had promised to wipe Kevin's debts out of an old man's accounts. And Kevin had agreed to look the other way for the price of his own rescue. I didn't yell at him. There's no point yelling at a man who's already drowning. I just asked him one thing. Kevin, when you texted me in March telling me to leave Grandpa alone, did you write that yourself or did Dad? He went pale. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. He left without another word. And I stood in the doorway watching him go. And I understood that my father hadn't built this wall alone. He'd handed out bricks. And the people who loved being told they didn't have to choose had taken them. Dolores got me 20 minutes that afternoon. Real minutes. The door closed. My father out at the bank. I sat on the edge of the bed and held Arthur's hand and told him I needed him to listen with the part of him that used to take a watch apart on the kitchen table. He smiled at that. Then he reached under his pillow with his shaking hand and pulled out a paper. Folded into quarters. Soft at the creases from being handled. He pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers over it. It was a photocopy of the power of attorney, his copy. He'd asked Dolores to make it for him on the floor's machine. Because some part of him had known it was the thing at the center of everything. I signed what he put in front of me, Arthur said. And his voice was steady even though his hand wasn't. After your grandmother passed. And again last year, more papers. I didn't read them. My hand shook too bad to hold the pages and he kept raising his voice and I just wanted him to stop. He looked at me and there was no fog in his eyes. Only shame. Which is a thing only a clear mind can feel. He told me you'd left. He told me, she left. She doesn't get a say. He said it about you so many times I started saying it back. I unfolded the paper on my knee and read it while he watched. And I held two things in my hand at once. The document and the truth of how he'd signed it. And I knew that those two things together were either the wall my father had built or the crack that would bring it down. It depended entirely on what I did next. I read the document twice. It was exactly what Foster had guessed. A broad financial power of attorney, durable, naming Gordon as agent. Signed 7 years back and amended once last spring. The amendment widened my father's authority to manage and transfer Arthur's accounts and property. That's how the truck changed hands. That's how the savings walked out the door wearing a legal coat. Then I did the other thing Foster told me to do, the thing that mattered more than any signature. I tested him. Not to trick him. To protect him. Because if I was going to build a case on his competence, I needed to know it would hold under a doctor's questions and a judge's. I asked him the date. He told me and added that it was a Thursday and the cafeteria did meatloaf on Thursdays and he intended to skip it. I asked him where he was and why. He told me plainly. His heart in his lungs and the fall on the porch steps. I asked him if he understood what a power of attorney did. He said, "It lets a man act for me, and I can take it back if I've got the sense to know I'm doing it." I asked if he wanted to take it back. He looked at me with those clear eyes and said, "From the day I figured out he was using it against you, yes." There was no confusion in him. There was a frail body and a sharp mind. And the law cares about the second one. I folded the paper back up and put it in my jacket over my heart where I could feel it. Then I went to make some calls. My father found out I'd been in the room. Cynthia must have told him. By the time I came back that evening, he'd had security post a note at the desk. And he was waiting in the hall again. Redder this time. "You don't have authorization to be near him," he said loud enough for the staff to turn. "I have power of attorney. I can have you removed." A younger me would have argued the law at him right there. Won the point. And lost the war. I didn't. I asked calmly to speak with the hospital's social worker. Because I knew that the moment a family fight reaches that desk, the hospital's own machinery starts to turn. A man named Simon Hayes came out. Case manager. Lanyard. A tired patience that matched Dolores's. I introduced myself by my full name and my job and I watched his attention sharpen. Because a paralegal who knows the words decisional capacity is not a relative he can wave off. I told him evenly that there was a dispute about my grandfather's wishes, that I had reason to believe he was being isolated, and that the patient himself had the right to a capacity assessment and the right to decide who visits him. My father started talking over me about the POA. Simon raised a hand. "Sir," he said, "a power of attorney for a competent patient doesn't override the patient. If Mr. Vance has capacity, Mr. Vance decides." My father's face did the second hand flicker again. Simon turned to me and said he'd arrange for the attending to evaluate capacity in the morning. It wasn't a victory. It was a door opening an inch. But I've learned that an inch is all you need if you've got your foot ready. That night, I worked the way I work a closing, with a legal pad and a phone and no patience for my own feelings until the list was done. I called Foster back and we drafted 3 documents together over email line by line. First, a revocation of the existing power of attorney, naming it by date so there'd be no wiggle. Second, a new durable power of attorney appointing me, with the narrow, honest powers Arthur actually wanted. Third, an advanced healthcare directive, so no one could ever again decide who walked through his door but him. Then I found the harder piece. A notary who would come to a hospital bed. I called 5 before a mobile notary named Eileen said she could be there the next afternoon. ID required. The patient had to be alert and willing. Alert and willing, Arthur was both. And a doctor was about to put it in writing. I lined the appointments up like gears in one of his movements. The capacity assessment in the morning, the notary after lunch, witnesses arranged through Simon and Dolores. I sat on the motel bed with the documents printing one floor down at the front office, and for the first time I let myself believe I might actually get there. Then my phone buzzed. It was a colleague at the firm forwarding me something she thought I'd want to see. A filing she'd spotted while pulling records for me at the county courthouse. My father, it turned out, had not been sitting still while I built my list. He'd gone to court that very afternoon, and he'd filed for something that could lock me out for good before a single one of my documents was worth the paper it printed on. An emergency guardianship petition. My father had asked the probate court to declare Arthur incapacitated, and to appoint himself as guardian of both person and estate. I read it twice in the motel light. It was clever in the way desperate things are clever. If a judge declared Arthur incompetent, then nothing Arthur signed afterward would mean anything. My revocation would be void. My new power of attorney would be scrap. Even his right to choose his own visitors would pass to my father by court order. And the petition was full of soft poison. It described Arthur as confused and vulnerable. It described me as an estranged granddaughter who abandoned the family years ago and reappeared as the patient's death approached, attempting to influence him. It asked for an emergency hearing, the kind the court schedules inside 72 hours when someone claims a vulnerable adult is in immediate danger. The danger in my father's telling was me. I'll be honest. For about a minute, I felt the old urge to go quiet, to retreat to Cleveland and let the lawyers fight it on paper while I told myself I'd done my best. That urge is the thing in me my father had always counted on. I put it down. Because a hearing isn't only a danger. A hearing is a room with a judge in it where the patient gets a voice and the truth gets a witness stand. My father thought he was building a higher wall. He'd actually just scheduled the public reckoning I needed and didn't know how to call myself. I had 72 hours, 3 documents, 1 doctor, and a grandfather who still knew his own mind. I started getting ready. Quick pause, because this is the part where a lot of people would have started screaming or driven home to lick their wounds and call it trying. I didn't. If you believe the calmest person in the room is usually the one holding the truth, tap that like button so this reaches someone who needs the reminder today. Now, the 72 hours before the hearing. Cynthia spent those 72 hours doing the thing she was best at. She worked the town. Millbrook is small and my father's family has been in it a long time. A story moves through a place like that faster than any filing. By Thursday, the version going around was hers. I heard it from the woman at the motel desk who didn't know I was the granddaughter in it. Did you hear about the Vances? Granddaughter vanished for years. Now she's back sniffing around the old man's money before he's even cold. Cynthia told it at the church, the salon, in the hospital waiting room where she held court with a paper cup of coffee and a wounded expression. She wasn't lying with documents the way my father did. She was lying with sympathy, which is harder to fight because you can't subpoena a rumor. And I understood standing in that motel office exactly what kind of fight this was. My father's weapon was paper. My brother's was silence. And Cynthia's was the whisper. None of them planned to meet me with the truth because the truth wasn't on their side. So I made a decision about my own weapon. I wasn't going to win this in the salon or the waiting room. I wasn't going to trade rumors. I was going to win it in the one place a whisper can't follow, where you have to raise your right hand and a record gets made. Let them have the town. I'd take the courtroom. Kevin caught me in the parking lot that night and said quietly, almost like an apology, "Dad's scared, Penelope. He's really scared." I told him, scared men still answer for what they do. Then I went back to work. The capacity assessment happened Friday morning and I wasn't allowed in the room, which was right. Dr. Mendoza was an internist with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the unhurried manner of someone who has had this exact conversation 1,000 times. She spent 45 minutes with Arthur. Simon told me afterward what those evaluations look for, and I knew already from my work. Does the patient understand his situation? Can he reason about choices? Can he express a consistent wish and explain why? She asked him about his heart and his money and his family. She asked him what a power of attorney was. And she asked him what he wanted. When she came out, she found me in the family room and she didn't smile because doctors don't celebrate. But she gave me the thing I needed. Your grandfather has decisional capacity, she said. His body is failing. His judgment is intact. I'll document it. She told me the report would be dated today fresh. The kind a court takes seriously precisely because it's recent and clinical, and it isn't coming from someone with a stake. I asked if she understood what it meant for the hearing. She looked at me over her glasses. It means, she said, that whatever that man decides for himself, the law has to listen. I went and sat with Arthur after and I told him what the doctor said. He nodded like it was obvious because to him it was. I've always known my own mind, he said. It's the rest of me that quit. Then he asked when the lady with the stamp was coming. The notary. He was ready. So was I. Eileen the notary arrived after lunch with a folder and a stamp and a careful neutral way of speaking that I've come to love in people who handle other people's signatures. She checked Arthur's ID against his face. She asked him his name, the date, and whether he understood he was signing legal documents of his own free will. He answered every question. And he added, because he couldn't help himself, that the date was a Friday, and Fridays were the only good day to fix a mantel clock because you weren't rushing toward Monday. Eileen almost smiled. Dolores stood as one witness. Simon stood as the other, official lanyard and all. Then, one page at a time, I watched my grandfather take his life back. He signed the revocation of the old power of attorney, his shaking hand making the letters slow and deliberate. And I had to look away for a second because the bravery of a frightened old man steadying his own hand is a thing I wasn't ready for. He signed the new power of attorney, naming me with the narrow powers he wanted and no more. He signed the healthcare directive that said who could and couldn't decide for him and who could walk through his door. Each signature Eileen notarized. Each one the witnesses confirmed. When it was done, Arthur set the pen down and let out a long breath, like a man who'd carried something heavy up a flight of stairs and finally set it on the landing. There, he said. Now it's mine again. It was the most important work I'd ever done. And I hadn't signed a single line of it. I just held the door open long enough for him to do it himself. Documents don't matter until the right people know they exist. So I spent the rest of Friday serving notice, the boring, decisive work that wins quiet wars. I gave a certified copy of the revocation and the new power of attorney to Simon, who logged them in Arthur's chart and updated the decision-maker. So the hospital now answered to me and to Arthur, not to my father. I emailed Foster the signed set, and he sent formal notice to the bank that Gordon's authority over Arthur's accounts was revoked, effective immediately, which froze the bleeding midstream. I had a copy hand-delivered to my father's attorney before the close of business, because a hearing where the other side learns the ground has shifted on the courthouse steps is a hearing I want. My father found out around 5 o'clock. I was in the hallway outside Arthur's room when he came off the elevator with the paper in his fist. And for the first time in my life, I watched Gordon Vance lose the gentle voice entirely. "You think a piece of paper changes anything?" he shouted, loud enough that 2 nurses stepped out of the station. "I'm his son. I've been here. Where were you?" I let him finish. Then I said just above a whisper, "I was on the other end of a phone you blocked." I didn't say anything else. I walked past him into Arthur's room and closed the door softly behind me. Through it I could hear him still going. And I could hear his voice get smaller the longer no one answered it. That's the thing about a man who's only ever won by being the loudest. Take away the silence he's shouting into, and there's not much left. Freezing the account stopped the future. The past still needed answering for. So I did 2 more things before the weekend closed. I filed a report with Adult Protective Services, plainly with dates and the doctor's finding and the messages from the phone. Because what had happened to Arthur was elder financial abuse, whether or not anyone in my family wanted to call it that. And through Foster, I sent a formal demand for an accounting, the legal request that forces an agent to show exactly what he did with the money he controlled. A complete accounting would take weeks and a court order to compel. But the moment the bank answered to Arthur again, I could pull his recent statements myself. Even that first thin stack told the story I already knew in outline. Over 18 months, my father had moved the bulk of Arthur's savings into a joint account he controlled. A little at a time, so no single transfer would trip an alarm. He'd retitled and refinanced the truck and pulled cash out of it. He'd paid down a chunk of Kevin's credit cards from Arthur's money, the rescue he'd promised. None of it forged. All of it done with that real 7-year-old signature he'd treated like a master key. The cruelty wasn't in some dramatic theft. It was in the patience of it. The way he dressed robbery up as caretaking and counted on no one checking. Least of all the granddaughter he'd already told everyone had run off. APS logged the report and opened its own inquiry. The slow kind that outlasts any hearing. Those first statements became an exhibit, and every quiet, patient transfer my father had made in the dark was about to be read out loud in a room with a judge in it. He'd had 18 months of nobody looking. He had about 72 hours left of that. The court did what courts do when someone petitions to take away another person's rights. It sent its own eyes. A guardian ad litem was appointed, a lawyer named Marilyn Shaw, whose only job was to figure out what was actually best for Arthur. Beholden to no one in the family, she interviewed all of us. I gave her the documents, the doctor's finding, the phone, and I made myself answer her hardest questions honestly, including why I'd let 4 months pass. I trusted a wall I should have tested sooner, I told her. That's on me. I'm testing it now. She wrote it down. Then she spent an afternoon with my father, who, I'm told, performed the devoted son beautifully. He talked about all he'd sacrificed, the months he'd spent at the bedside, the daughter who'd vanished. But Miss Shaw had already sat with Arthur for an hour by then. And Arthur, when asked plainly what he wanted, had told her plainly. He wanted his granddaughter. He wanted his money back in his own name. He wanted to choose where he spent whatever Fridays he had left. A guardian ad litem can tell the difference between a man being manipulated and a man being heard, because asking that question is the entire job. When she filed her report for the emergency hearing, it recommended against the guardianship. It found Arthur competent, found his recent documents valid, and noted in the careful language of the court credible concern regarding the petitioner's prior use of his authority. My father had asked the court to look closely at our family. The court had looked. It just hadn't seen what he wanted it to. The night before the hearing, my father was waiting by my car in the motel lot. No Cynthia, no audience. Just him, smaller in the dark than he'd seemed in any hallway. I almost didn't recognize the man in his voice. "The business is gone, Penelope," he said. "Did you know that? 20 years and it's gone."
I'm 62.
Nobody hires 62. He told me he'd lain awake doing the math on his own old age and found nothing in the column where money should be. He told me that when he was a boy, Arthur had $500 for my certificate and not one for his son's failing shop, and that it had sat in him for years like a splinter working toward the bone. I wasn't stealing from him, he said, and I think he believed it. I was just taking what I'd be owed anyway. A little early. For a moment, I saw the frightened man under the father. I felt something I hadn't expected, which was not forgiveness, but a kind of grief for the person he might have been if fear had made him ask instead of take. Then I remembered the message in the drafts folder. "I am scared," in a shaking hand. "Going nowhere." "If you needed help," I said, "you could have asked him. He'd have given it. Instead, you erased me and told him I'd left, so he'd have no one to ask but you." He didn't answer. I unlocked my car. "I'll see you in court," I said. Not unkindly. He'd had his moment to be human. He'd used it to explain, not to apologize. So tomorrow I'd let the law do the rest. The probate courtroom in Millbrook is a plain room with bad acoustics and a flag in the corner. And it was fuller than an emergency hearing usually gets because Cynthia had made sure of it. There were faces from the church and the salon there to see the granddaughter who'd come back for the money. Kevin sat in the second row, looking at his hands. Simon and Dolores were there under subpoena. Miss Shaw and Foster beside me, though he'd told me on the steps that I'd be doing most of the talking. Because I knew this case in my bones, and judges trust the person who lived it. And there, in a wheelchair near the front, with an oxygen line at his nose, was Arthur. Because he'd insisted on coming. Because a man being declared incompetent has the right to show up and prove otherwise. My father's attorney went first. He painted the picture the petition had promised. A vulnerable, confused old man. A devoted son who'd given up everything to care for him. And a granddaughter estranged for years who'd swept in at the end to turn a dying man against his own family and seize control of his estate. He was good. He used my 4 months of silence like a knife. And then my father leaned forward and said it himself to the judge in a voice gone hard. The line he'd been saying to Arthur for a year. "She left. She doesn't get a say." The room murmured. Somewhere behind me someone said, "That's right." Under her breath. I felt every eye in that room land on me. I felt the old urge rise, to shrink, to go quiet, to let the loudest man win the way he always had. I stood up instead. I buttoned my jacket. And I asked the court in the calmest voice I owned for permission to respond. I didn't raise my voice once. I'd learned long ago that in a room built for shouting, the quiet voice is the one people lean in to hear. I began with the law, because the law was on my side and my father's feelings were not the question before the court. "Your Honor, every adult is presumed competent unless this court finds otherwise. The petitioner is asking you to find otherwise. The evidence won't let you." Then I laid it out one exhibit at a time, sliding each copy to the clerk. Dr. Mendoza's capacity assessment, dated the day she examined him, finding Arthur possessed of full decisional capacity. The guardian ad litem's report, independent, court-appointed, recommending against the guardianship and finding Arthur competent and clear in his wishes. The properly executed, notarized, witnessed revocation of the old power of attorney. The new power of attorney and healthcare directive signed by Arthur's own hand in front of a notary, a charge nurse, and a hospital case manager. I let the documents do what documents do. which is sit there being true while everyone looks at them. Guardianship is the most restrictive option the law has, I said. This court is required to prefer the least restrictive alternative. My grandfather has already chosen one. He revoked an authority that was being misused and he appointed his own agent. The least restrictive alternative is to let a competent man's choices stand. Then I picked up the bank statements and I kept my voice exactly level. The petition calls my grandfather vulnerable. He was, but not to me. Over 18 months, the petitioner used a convenience power of attorney to move the bulk of my grandfather's savings into an account he controlled, to refinance his truck, and to pay down a third party's personal debts. I didn't look at Kevin. I didn't have to. Adult Protective Services has an open inquiry. These transfers are already in the record before you, and a full accounting will show the rest. My father's attorney objected, said this was a guardianship hearing, not a fraud trial. The judge, a gray woman who'd clearly seen this exact play before, said mildly that the petitioner's prior exercise of authority is directly relevant to whether he should be handed more of it. I sat down. My father was no longer leaning forward. He was gripping the table and his jaw was working. I could see the calm he'd worn for a year starting to come apart at the seams. Then Arthur asked to speak. The judge asked if he was able. He said, "Dry as a stone, young lady. I've been able for 86 years. And even the church ladies in the back laughed. Which is the moment I knew it was over, though my father hadn't felt it yet. They wheeled him forward. He didn't have the breath for a speech, so he kept it short. And short was a blade. I'm not confused, he said. I'm dying. They're different things. My heart's quitting. My head isn't. He looked at the judge, not at my father. My son told me my granddaughter abandoned me. He showed me messages. I believed him for a while because believing him hurt less than the truth. Then he turned his head slow and looked at Gordon for the first time all morning. He told me I didn't want to see her. He told me she didn't want to see me. He wrote both on my own phone. The room went very still. He told me she left. She doesn't get a say. Arthur's voice didn't rise, but it didn't shake either. Not on this. Here's my say. I ask for her every single day. He's the one who kept her from coming. And that was when my father broke. He came up out of his chair shouting. All the gentle gone. The performance gone. Just a frightened man at the end of a thing he couldn't control. He doesn't know what he's saying. She got to him. Can't you see? She got to him. He was loud enough that the bailiff moved. I didn't move at all. I stayed in my seat with my hands folded, because I understood finally and completely that the calmest person in the room was the one the room would believe. The judge let the silence sit after my father ran out of breath. Then she spoke unhurried. She found on clear and convincing evidence that Arthur Vance possessed capacity. She denied the petition for guardianship. She confirmed the validity of the revocation and the new power of attorney. She ordered that the wrongful restriction on visitation cease at once, that Arthur choose his own visitors going forward, and that a full accounting be completed and referred with the APS findings for further proceedings. She looked at my father over her glasses as she said the last part, and there was nothing gentle in it. He had walked into that room to be handed control of a man's whole life. He walked out with less than he'd come in with, and a case file with his name on it. Arthur lived 13 more weeks. We spent them well. With the guardianship dead and the power of attorney his again, he chose his own next chapter. A small assisted living place 2 streets from the shop where he'd repaired clocks for 32 years. So he could see the storefront from his window. I was his agent, but I never once had to use the authority. He kept his own mind to the end and made his own calls, which is exactly how he wanted it. The accounting was finished and the numbers were ugly. But the court ordered restitution of what could be traced. The bank reversed the transfers that hadn't cleared. A good chunk of his savings came home. Adult Protective Services substantiated the case. The matter of the rest went where such matters go, slowly, through the civil and criminal channels that don't care how devoted a son says he is. Kevin's rescue evaporated the day the accounts froze. His debts were his own again. The last I heard, he was finally, at 39, paying them himself. As for boundaries, I didn't scream. I didn't gloat. I had the locks changed on Arthur's house, which was still his, And I made sure my father's contact ran through Foster's office and the court in writing, where it belonged. Cynthia stopped telling her story when the courtroom told a different one to the same town. And my father, in the end, got the thing he'd been so afraid of. An old age with an empty column where the money should be. Except now he'd earned the emptiness himself. I sat with Arthur on his good days. We took apart a mantel clock he'd never finished, spreading the tiny gears on a towel. He showed me with his shaking hands how each one only works because the one beside it does. On his last clear afternoon he held my hand and said, "You didn't let him win." I told him I'd had a good teacher. He said, "The thing I think about most now, the thing I'll leave you with, it was never about staying or leaving. It was about who shows up the right way when you can't stand up yourself." A person's worth was never measured by whether they stayed in the town they were born in, but by whether they were willing to stand up the right way when the one who raised them no longer could. That's my story. One nurse who noticed. One phone that finally told the truth. And a grandfather who knew his own mind to the very end. If this reminded you to check who holds power of attorney for someone you love, or to ask your parents one honest question this week, take it as a sign and do it today. Share this with someone who needs it. Comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.